the 20th century dawned and big business boomed, many had come to call the previous 20 years the Gilded Age. Wealthy families like the Carnegies, Vanderbilts, and Rockefellers enjoyed the fruits of big business and the fruits of others' labor. But for most American families, it was far from a Gilded Age, as they incurred the harsh realities of sweatshops, slums, child labor, corruption in government and business, disease, and racial prejudice. As Americans ushered in a new century, they began to demand change, equality, reform, and the Progressive Era was born.
Sinclair used the horrors he witnessed as the basis for Jurgis's fictionalized story. As Jurgis discovers, work in the plant involves back-breaking labor in unsafe conditions. When a worker becomes ill or gets injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him. Workers in the pickling room have their fingers eaten by acid. Cooks live in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that permeated also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up the chute in the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
When The Jungle was published, there was a public outcry. Americans were outraged, and they urged the United States Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. More federal laws followed that prevented packers from adding fillers and impurities to meat. And United States Department of Agriculture inspectors were put in every meat plant in the country. But this wasn't the reaction that Sinclair was looking for. He wanted to help the workers. "I aimed at the public's heart," he wrote, "and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." It took decades to improve the working conditions Sinclair criticized in The Jungle. The changes came from inside the factories themselves, from members of labor unions making demands of the factory owners. The Jungle's pro-worker viewpoint may have been lost on the public at the time, but its powerful message is clear today.
It was a microcosm, a look at the 20th century as it was unfolding and all the different battle lines between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And in that sense, it's an enduring classic.
On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. Of the 500 women employees who worked in the sweatshop-like conditions, 146 would die. Negligence on the part of the management and unsafe working conditions were to blame. In order to keep the women working at their sewing machines all day, the management locked the doors that led to the exits. As the fire spread rapidly, fed by fabric, the panicked women tried to find an escape. The poorly maintained fire escape collapsed, killing many and leaving many more to jump to their deaths in an effort to avoid being burned. A few days later, 80,000 people marched to protest the unsafe working conditions that led to the tragedy. The owners of the factory were tried for and acquitted on charges of manslaughter. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was a sad reminder that while many reforms were indeed being enacted, there were large numbers of Americans who were untouched by the benefits of the progressive era. Women were generally not allowed to join labor unions, and the workplace reforms that helped clean up the factories in which men worked often did little for women. Likewise, progressive reforms generally ignored problems of racial, ethnic, and religious persecution. With the lack of the support from the government, minority groups had to seek reform for themselves.
Wilson set to work with much success. He convinced the Senate to pass the Underwood-Simmons tariff, which for the first time since the Civil War reduced tariff rates. Next, he pursued financial reform by establishing a private banking system under federal control to make credit more available throughout the country and quickly adjust the amount of money in circulation. The Federal Reserve System was one of Wilson's greatest achievements and is the cornerstone of our economy even today. The next year, Wilson helped establish the Federal Trade Commission and signed into law the Clayton Antitrust Act. Both the commission and the act were aimed at stopping unfair business practices.